Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to give it another minute or so. Okay, we can go ahead and get started. I did just this morning get finally a version of the D2L page up and running for the course. So go ahead and take a look at that, and I'll be adding to it hopefully in a couple of days, getting things established. So let me go ahead and show that to you. So the tabs that you'll use the most are the content tab. I've got a start here tab where there's 3 things that I'd like you to do just to familiarize yourself with the course and get started. And then the other tab that you'll be using is the communication tab where you can find discussions. And we've got a discussion started here. So that's that. So today we're going to talk about theories of constitutional interpretation. And what we mean by that is when the Constitution has ambiguity to it, how do judges know what the words mean? Where do they go to look for some clarification and extra information? And so let me share a slide. Oops, I got it on the wrong one. Oh, I think I have it on the right one now. Okay, so some parts of the Constitution are pretty clear. And so one example that we can talk about is Article 1, Section 2, Sentence 2. Article 1 is the part of the Constitution that creates the legislative branch. And so when it's talking about qualifications to be a member of the House, it says no person shall be a representative who shall have not attained the age of 25 years. Okay, that's pretty clear. So we don't need much help understanding that. We can just read those words and a judge would say, well, that guy's 27 when he was elected, so yeah, he, that he meets that qualification. But there's other parts of the Constitution that are a lot bigger and have more ambiguity. So I went to a part of the Constitution that earlier this year was talked about a lot. The other, just to interrupt myself, I'm going to talk about the ambiguity surrounding what high crimes and misdemeanors are in impeachment proceedings and removal from office. I had to stop and think, was it just January of this year that we had an impeachment? And I thought, that can't be. It must have been a year ago, because what a difference a pandemic makes. It just, changes your whole notion of time. I couldn't believe that was just, you know, like 7, 8 months ago. Anyway, so, you know, the president can be removed on impeachment and conviction for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So how is a judge supposed to interpret a phrase like high crimes and misdemeanors? And that's where our theories of interpretation come in, because all it's referring to is this is the method a judge uses to bring some meaning to parts of the Constitution where it's not clear what it means. And so typically the theories of the constitutional interpretation, and sometimes they're referred to as jurisprudential theories, but we'll just call them interpretive theories or theories of interpretation. It generally talks about where outside the Constitution would you look for extra meaning. So do you look to historical documents, and if you do, how do you understand those historical documents? And so there's different authors identified different numbers of interpretive theories, and it's not that they all are saying something completely different. It's that some combine more of the theories into a single category. Your author identifies 4 broad theories of interpretation, and so we'll take a look at those. So these are common. Most authors divide them up into a few more, but 4, that's fine, because they're just a little bit broader. So the first one we'll talk about is originalism. And this is, if any of them, this is probably the one that you've heard of before when, during confirmation hearings, when the Senate is questioning judges in recent years, they'll talk about, are you an originalist? Now, the phrase we often hear about is original intent, but there's actually 2 flavors of originalism. In both cases, they mean originalism is you're looking to history for your answer. And in both flavors of originalism, the Constitution means now what it meant at the time it was written, whether that be the original Constitution, which is written in 1787, or whether that means the Bill of Rights, which is written in 1789, or whether you're talking about an amendment. The 14th Amendment was written in 1868. So it means whatever it meant at the time it was written. And the 2 flavors are original intent and original public meaning. So original intent, and that's the one that you've probably heard about, that means you're trying to ask, what did the authors intend for it to mean? And so if we're trying to figure out, well, what did the authors of the Constitution intend for it to mean, we would look to things like some of the writings that maybe took place about the Constitutional Convention. So Madison kept the most complete notes of the convention, but we would look at Madison's notes and maybe other notes that were taken at the Constitutional Convention. We might also look to things that were written about the Constitution by those that were at the convention. And probably the most common or famous example of that would be to look at the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, at the time they were written, they weren't compiled into a book or anything. These were essays that appeared in newspapers in New York, written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, and they were essays that were arguing in favor of the Constitution and providing more discussion about what they were trying to achieve with the Constitution. So someone who believes in original intent might really dive deep down into, say, the Federalist Papers to try to see, okay, when they were talking about high crimes and misdemeanors, what did they say about that? Did they provide examples, to see what they intended for that clause of the Constitution to mean? The second flavor of originalism is something we call original public meaning. And Scalia, who died, gosh, it's been like 3 or 4 years now. Justice Scalia was a very famous originalist, but he wasn't an original intent guy. He would have said, no, 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 it's not original intent. It's original public meaning. He'd say, Scalia would have said original intent doesn't make any sense. He said, first of all, it was written by a committee. How are you ever supposed to know what a committee meant? You know, that they're going to have more than one intention for this document. He would say, second of all, they're written by politicians who might say outside of these words, you know, they might write something in the Constitution and later say what they intended. He says, but who can trust that? You know, you look at the words themselves and then ask, how would an average person at the time have understood it? So for the original public meaning, in terms of where do you look, you would look to maybe some of the writings that were done at the time of the ratification debates by regular people who weren't at the Constitutional Convention. The ratification debates, that was after the Constitution was written. In order for it to be ratified or become the actual Constitution, 9 of the 13 states had to have debates. They would choose people to go and talk about them, and then those people at this little ratifying convention would vote, and if a majority of them voted, then that state was considered to have ratified it. So these sometimes went on for months where they were discussing what they thought it meant. And so one of the things you might look also at what newspapers were writing about when they first read the Constitution and said, oh, look what they did here, and to see how they understood it. So again, originalist theories say it means now what it means then, and then it gets refined to it means what they intended it to mean. So you look at what the authors themselves said it mean, or original public meaning, which is you look to the average person at the time, what they wrote and said about it, and see if you can determine how the average person understood it. Another document you might look to for original public meaning might be dictionaries of the day. You know, there are words that over the last 200 years, their meanings have evolved a little bit. And so sometimes it's helpful to look up a word in the dictionary of the time. There was a case, oh gosh, it's been about 20 years ago now, but it came up. The question was, what does enumeration in the Constitution means? Because the Constitution mandates that every 10 years that there be a census and everybody be counted. And the language says that every 10 years there will be an enumeration of the population. And so this, under the Clinton administration, when they were getting ready for the 2020 census, prior to the 2020 census, the way they had always done it was they had tried to contact every person in the United States and count every single person one by one in the United States. Under the people who worked for the Census Bureau under Clinton had said, you know what, actual enumeration, or well, actual counting of people is actually not the most accurate way to determine how many people there are. There are statistical sampling ways where using equations, we can actually be a little more accurate. You might be thinking, how is that possible? Wouldn't actually counting things be better than statistical estimates? And the answer is not always. Think if somebody said to you that your job was to go count the grains of sand on this beach over here. So you start, 1, 2, 3, and then the wave comes up and moves them all around. Now, how do you know which ones you've counted? And people are kind of like that. Sometimes there's homeless people, there's people who aren't going to respond to your survey because they don't understand or they are afraid. And so sometimes you can, or you have limited resources. So sometimes you can get a more accurate count, or at least arguably so, by statistical means. And so it was challenged, that method, and they said, no, that's not an enumeration. Enumeration means counting one by one. And the other side said, no, enumeration just means how many people are there. It doesn't mean It doesn't specify the way you come about that. So the court looked to dictionaries at the time, and it was certainly true that their statistics and some statistical means and analysis were known of. There were mathematicians who talked about these kind of things, and they decided based on some of those dictionaries from the time that enumeration meant counting one by one for purposes of determining representation in the House of Representatives, because that's what it was for in the Constitution. They said, look, if for other reasons, like some laws say that federal laws will give certain amounts of money based on population to states, if you want to do that based on statistical calculations, that's fine. But for purposes of determining how many people are in the House of Representatives, it means counting them one by one. So again, that's an example when you might, in an original public meeting way, you might look to dictionaries of the time. Okay, so there's, and something I want to say about originalism before we move on to the next theory of interpretation is that this is not about, if a judge is an originalist, it's not about the judge thinking that things shouldn't change. It's about who in government should be the one to make the change. So an originalist judge says, look, maybe this, maybe some part of the Constitution, if I interpret it like it was supposed to mean originally, it's actually not workable in modern society. And so some people would say, some judges would say, okay, that's fine, it's not workable, but it's not our job to change it. We'll go ahead and interpret it in this way that we think it's historically accurate. And then if that's unworkable, it's job of elected legislatures to make that change. Because what they're worried about is people who think about originalism as a way of interpreting. They're worried about these unelected judges, because judges at the federal level are appointed, and they don't have the same accountability. So they say judges are supposed to just say what the law is and play it straight and not play politics. And the best way to constrain them, according to some originalists, is to say, look, you don't get to just pick out of air. Yes, it's ambiguous, but you don't just get to import your own desired meaning into it. This will restrict the range of things you can pick. And then if you play it fair and you interpret it in a way that worked at the time but doesn't work now, then it's for the Congress to take this up and to rewrite, to get an amendment to that part of the Constitution, or to rewrite a particular statute that's been interpreted. So again, it's not, a judge who is an originalist isn't saying that change should never happen. They're saying when change happens, it's only fair to let the elected branches do it. Because if the elected branches change things and the people don't like it, there's a mechanism for that. They're accountable at the next election. Whereas if a judge is the one that changes something in the law or the Constitution, they'll still continue to be there for 10, 20, 30 years. So it's about accountability and who should make the changes. Nobody's arguing that things shouldn't change. It's purely an argument about, is it appropriate for judges to make the change? Okay, so the next theory of interpretation that we're going to look at is, why it does that? Proceduralism. Proceduralism is a theory of interpretation that says when the words of the Constitution aren't clear, what you should rely on to help you is look to the basic core processes and procedures outlined in our democratic Constitution, and interpret the Constitution in a way that upholds those processes. So for example, some of the processes that they would identify are things like equal protection by all. So, you know, free and fair elections. They would say, interpret the Constitution in a way that upholds that idea of free and fair elections. Interpret the Constitution, another part of the process or procedures, the Constitution in a number of places promises due process for everybody. In other words, you don't go into it with an idea of how something's going to turn out. You go through the process and you trust the process, because if the core processes are sound, then the outcome is the outcome, and you're not putting a thumb on the scale for one side or the other. So other procedural things, you know, if the political process is broken, yes, judges should step in and interpret the Constitution in ways where it fixes that deficiency, or if dissent is being suppressed. That's a core part of the democratic procedure outlined in the Constitution. So it says the best way for things to be fair for everyone is to establish core procedures and let the procedures do the work, and you just follow the procedures. And it says there are core procedures in the Constitution: free and fair elections, due process, certain minority rights as a part of the procedural thing, and you just adhere to those procedures. And so when you're interpreting the Constitution, you do it in the way that best bolsters those core democratic procedures in the Constitution. A third kind of interpretation, and this one seems kind of similar, so let me see if I can help explain the difference. The third type of interpretive theory that your textbook describes is something called a moral reading of the Constitution. And scholars like Dworkin are fond of this one. And basically, Dworkin argued that, yeah, there's some core processes that are described in the Constitution, but more important than that, there are also substantive core values, core moral ideas or values that are embedded in the Constitution. And that should be the backdrop for interpreting what the Constitution means. So for different legal philosophers have different core values they tease out, but some of the common ones are dignity. Is the way that you're interpreting the law upholding core dignity for people? Another core value or a core moral ideal is equality. Is the way that you are interpreting the Constitution upholding equality for everyone? Freedom or liberty would be another core value. And then that person would say, when you're interpreting the Constitution where it's ambiguous, interpret it in the way that favors the core value of liberty or freedom. So in proceduralism, you're honoring process, which process is kind of agnostic. Process says you follow these processes because they're fair and they work, and the outcome is the outcome. You don't bias. You don't try to predict the outcome. You might not like the outcome, but if these processes are fair, they're going to work. A moral reading or a values reading says, no, you consider the outcome, because at the end of the day, that core outcome is what you want, and that's how you should interpret the Constitution. And then the final one that your author talks about is something he calls pragmatism. Sometimes other authors will call this a prudential reading of the Constitution. Oops. But what it refers to is, it says, look, all of these other theories that you've talked about, you're only looking either to the past or you're looking internally. You need to look outside of the court, outside of your ivory tower, and your ideals and your theories, those are fine as far as they go, but how is this going to impact real people on the ground? is this just going, you know, maybe in an ideal world, the pure logic and the pure reasoning would take you to a particular conclusion. But if that conclusion just is unworkable, or it's going to cause chaos, or it's going to harm a lot of people, then you need to temper your interpretation of the Constitution.
Got the kids dressed, braided the girl's hair, got myself ready, and we were in the car by 7:40.
So you need to temper your interpretation of the Constitution by considering the real world implications, because when the Supreme Court interprets something, it has a real world impact. And it's not saying that you should try to get the real world impact that you would want. All it's saying is that a certain amount of common sense is called for when you're interpreting the Constitution. These are more than just ideas in a philosophy class. This is a document that actually means something and will profoundly affect people's lives. So, you know, sometimes, you know, in a philosophy class, you'll do thought experiments, and, you know, where pretend this happens. And then if that thought experiment, you know, if you put that out into the real world and say, okay, this was the pure reasoning, but it goes to an absurd place when I look at the real world and I think how that would play out. So what we're gonna do next is, what I'd like to do is I'm going to break us out in, or separate us into breakout rooms. And I'd like for you to discuss for 3 or 4 minutes, if you had to pick one of these 4 theories, originalism, proceduralism, the moral reading, or pragmatism, which one do you think is better than others? Now, the real answer is there might be times when it would be better to use one than another. But I want to force you to consider overall which one do you think is the strongest and the one worth arguing for. So we're just going to discuss that for 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm going to send you to breakout rooms. Go ahead and discuss, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what you guys came up with. So regardless of how it came out in your group, in the chat, put which of the four methods you thought was the best. Just originalism or proceduralism. Just put that in the chat, and then let's talk a little bit. So it looks like it's interesting. Well, have a couple of proceduralisms. Looks like we have all four represented. So so let me pick on somebody. David, why did you pick originalism?
Because I think we need to follow the original meaning.
How come?
How come we have to follow the original meaning? I think that's a hard question. I'm not prepared for that answer. I think my real reason for originalism is because I think that's what we follow today. And when you're talking about it, saying that that's what the founding fathers do, and we interpret the way we do now, I think they basically hit a lot of like original meanings, and then we interpret those today.
Okay. Let me let's look to proceduralism. Dennis, why did you choose proceduralism?
I picked proceduralism because I like the way it interpreted the Constitution and like the guarantees of fair procedures for everybody. I don't know. I like the ways. I don't know. It was just for all.
Okay. And sort of in a way, you could say that proceduralism is agnostic about, look, we're not trying to bias anything. You treat everybody fair and it'll shake out okay. What about Leah? Leah Inman, why did you choose moralism?
I chose moralism because I feel like as long as you stick to what you know is right, not just for you, but for your community and the people around you, that the least amount of people get hit in the crossfire with whatever is going on.
Okay. And then, Rachel, why did you choose the pragmatism?
I chose pragmatism because to me, well, it was close between proceduralism or pragmatism, but I believe like the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So I feel like you have to really think whenever you're making a decision like that, like even if you disagree with it, like who would benefit and like would it be the greatest benefit for all? Because with the other ones, like moral reading, like I would agree, like okay, like what is most moral should be what goes, but like my morals could be different from someone else's morals, whereas like I believe gay marriage is right and people should be allowed to do what they want to do. Someone might not believe that morally, so then it's like a clash there. And proceduralism, while that one was like the next to the pragmatism, like what I would pick is because I do believe everybody should be treated fairly. And that's why I'm furthest away from originalism, because I feel like the founding fathers, yeah, they had, I guess, what they thought were good intentions, but I think we can't really, like, my one person in the breakout room with me was saying, I think it was Steven, he was saying that he basically, like, it's a living, breathing document, the Constitution, so we can't really, like, 200 years from now, the way things are going in the world might be different from now, and like you can't really try and base things on what, I mean, you don't want to get too far from like what the country like but was originally intended to do, but it's like, I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but I'm just trying to say, like, we can't, like, who would have thought, like, everybody would have rights and that we wouldn't be living, that, like, black people and white people would be, well, equal, even though I don't think,
Legally equal. Yeah.
yeah, like, the founding fathers would have never thought that, so I just thought pragmatism made the most sense to me.
So, and this is, well, I guess I will ask you, Rachel, or anybody else that argued for anything but originalism, which is, so Rachel, what Scalia would say to you, well, maybe I agree with you, Rachel, that some of the things that worked at the time don't work now, but why don't you let the legislative process take care of it? Because they're the ones that are elected and accountable to the public. He would say, I just don't think unelected judges should be the one doing the changing. And I'm not picking on you. If somebody else, anybody who argued for anything but originalism.
I got it.
Okay.
So I had given this example in my breakout group, but one thing that is the reason that any of the three, especially moral reading and pragmatism, I place above originalism. The biggest example in my mind is strictly following originalism. In my mind, that would prevent certain like events, such as, for instance, Brown versus Board of Education. That decision would not happen strictly following originalism in my mind.
So you've buried the more direct way of saying what you want to say. It's in there. We're going to tease it out of you. So what was Brown versus Board of Education an example of generically? What was that phenomenon?
Man, I'm trying to figure out what exactly the answer you're looking for there is.
Well, because I think what you and correct me if I'm reading you wrong, but I think what you might be saying is sometimes legislatures won't do the hard work of changing, even when it's the right thing.
Yeah, like I was thinking almost the converse of, you know, not to necessarily discredit originalism as a whole or any, you know, accredited judges that are in support of it, but I personally think the statement of saying, oh, I just think elected officials should be one to change, to make the major changes as opposed to these appointed judges. While that sounds good on paper, saying that, you know, only people elected by the people should make change, not people appointed, it also, in a more cynical way, can be viewed as kind of a shirking of responsibility. If your job is to interpret the Constitution and make sure that people are, you know, ultimately your job is both the people and the government. You are the responsibility checker for both of them to make sure that people aren't going against the Constitution and that, you know, elected bodies like the Congress and president aren't going against the Constitution. And I think having this only the president or Congress or elected offices can make these major changes idea prevents the Supreme Court from ever stepping in whenever they think, you know, Congress has done something that we think goes against the Constitution or something like that.
Sure. And you bring up a really interesting point about our Constitution that was different than constitutions before it, which is that we have what you would call an entrenched Constitution. And what that means is that it's harder to change the Constitution than it is to pass a regular law. So one of the ways of saying it is that we have a written Constitution, although what all that means is that we can identify precisely what's in our Constitution. So, in the United States, if you say what's in the Constitution, you get one of these little documents or you look it up on the web and we all agree, this is what's the Constitution. And anything that's in here is harder to change than it is to just write a law and pass a law. So for example, to pass a law, you need to have both houses of Congress pass it by a majority. And with the weird rules in the Senate now, it's kind of sort of you need 60, but that's because it should be a majority, but it's the use of the technical filibuster for everything, which makes it 60. But anyway, it's still easier than changing the Constitution. And then after both houses pass it, all that you need to happen is that the president not veto it, and then it's law. Whereas to change the Constitution, you have to get both the House and the Senate to approve it by a 2/3 vote. And then you're not done yet because you have to send it out to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. The state legislature has to vote and say, hey, we agree with that too. So this is a much more durable document. And one of the things it says in the Constitution, or at least how the Supreme Court has interpreted it, is, okay, so the Constitution says government's not going to do this, that, and the other. Sometimes government does this, that, or the other, and the court is put in the position in an implied way, in a direct way by what the court said. The court said, look, you told us to be bound by the Constitution. We take an oath to it, just like you guys did. And you passed this law that's inconsistent with it. So it's our job to say you can't do that. Which that was a new thing. In Great Britain, they have what's called an unwritten constitution, not because it's not written down on paper, but because it's just laws over time that make up what a constitution would be. So for example, a constitution is a document that specifies the general structure of government and the relationship between the government and its people. So in Great Britain, they have laws that specify the structure of the government and laws about rights and stuff that shape the relationship between government and its people, but it's all done with normal laws. And so two constitutional scholars in Great Britain might have differing ideas about the scope of the past laws that make up their constitution. Some might identify more laws than another one because they'd say, oh, this is really a core document. Somebody else might say no. But the more important thing is it means it's not entrenched. So if there's a law that Parliament has passed that says you can't be held for more than 48 hours without being indicted or charged with a crime, all Parliament has to do to change that is to pass another law that says you can't be held more than 8 months without being charged by a crime. And the courts there would only look to, there's no document to compare it with because everything is done with a simple law. So the Constitution means whatever Parliament has most recently said that it means because it's not entrenched. And so I think what you might be suggesting, Gabriel, is that because we have this entrenched Constitution, that somebody has to be the arbitrator of, okay, are we sticking to the core values? And sometimes maybe that, I think you're making an argument that sometimes you can't trust the elected officials because they might fear the whims of majority that sometimes go in directions that might be counter to our core values.
Yeah,
And
that's
you're either thinking, I know that is not what I'm saying.
it's definitely along the lines I was thinking. I didn't want to necessarily I'm not trying to just inherently accuse Congress of corruption politically or anything, but I definitely think when we have historical examples, especially whenever it's something that, another thing originalism in my mind struggles with is new developments. So whenever you have Congress kind of swayed by political opinion, whenever it's something that they're not sure what the precedent is, 1800s, they have, after Civil War, slavery ended and people weren't really sure what to do there. In the last, couple years, couple decades, we have suddenly Congress doesn't know what to do with gay marriage. Congress doesn't know what to do with new technology. People, it was kind of a whole thing that last year, or was it last year? It feels like it's been forever. Congress not understanding half of what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about when he was discussing Facebook.
Yeah.
It's very much
Yeah,
so.
a couple of years ago, yeah.
Feels like it's been forever. It's one of those things that I think Congress, whether, not inherently maliciously, but at times acts with what they think or what their voters or their party is aiming towards, but doesn't always know exactly what the right direction constitutionally or what the values behind it would be. Acting in the interest of what their interest or some of the public's interest, but not necessarily in the general pursuit of freedom or of equality or something like that.
Sure. Ronald, not Ronald Dworkin. Oh, who's the guy that wrote A Theory of Justice? John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. And, because I'm thinking, as you were talking, Gabriel, I'm thinking, well, Congress has its problems. I don't know that it's so much corrupt. It's just really stuck, right now and not so functional. And, there's competing values going on there. But, we tend to, in the United States especially, kind of fetishize the Constitution. I mean, who says these values are any better than values we might come up with? Maybe these very core values are kind of hinky and, oh, look, I've underlined the 14th Amendment. I didn't know I'd written in all these. You should always carry one with you. If you were in my real class and in-person class, you would all have a copy of this. My gift to you. If you come to my office, I'll give you one.
I have one of those somewhere.
So anyway, there is tons of debate about how to interpret the Constitution, and your book breaks it up into just 4 categories. I mean, we could talk on and on. I'm only going to test you on the 4 methods outlined in the book. And this afternoon, I'm going to copy a few pages from the pages where he really defines these 4 methods and upload them in case some of you haven't gotten the book yet, but that's a yet, because I'm going to do that, this week. But I do, especially in this environment, it's really important to have the book, but I understand it might take some of you a while to get it. For example, he talks a little bit about textualism, but that's a theory you hear a lot about. Textualists say everything you need to know is within the 4 corners of the document of the Constitution. Clarence Thomas tends to be the most dominant textualist on the court at the moment. And so he would say, look, if you don't understand what part of the Constitution means with the words right here, read the whole document. And in the context of the whole document, you know, you have everything you need and you shouldn't be looking elsewhere. All of these theories have their flaws. So the core assumptions of the originalists are that it's a good way to limit the choices of judges because you don't want judges just to be making the law out of nothing. But what might be the flaw with that core assumption that it limits the choices of judges?
Is it too simple to say that it limits the choices of judges?
It is, and why? If we say, look, we can look to these historical documents and it's all there. What might be wrong with that? They're making an argument that if we look at these historical documents, it'll just be all clear. You know, it'll point to an answer. Well, when the court heard in 2010, 2008, 2010, the Supreme Court heard a couple of cases dealing with the Second Amendment. And this was a case where everybody went originalist. But in terms of the documentation provided, it was the battle of the historians, because you could get esteemed, well-credentialed historians that would say the Second Amendment really was a robust thing that meant everybody should have a gun, and or not paid for, but allowed to have a gun, and it's this really core right. Where other historians said, well, it was more of a thing of the states, because you know it was the states. Really, it was more of the right of a state to be able to create a militia to protect itself from a federal government gone rogue and trying to be a tyrant. And, you know, they were both very convincing. So history, I think one of the problems with originalism is that would be nice if it actually did limit the choices of judges. I mean, there are times maybe when you don't want to, but it assumes that history is kind of clear to determine both either what they intended or even how people understood it. There's usually more than one understanding of something or more than one intention. And then well, I won't belabor it by going through each one of them, but the core idea is that each one of these is flawed. And a couple of other things. Justices on the Supreme Court or other judges, if you were to say, which one of these philosophies do you use? They're trained to say, I don't use one of those philosophies. I say what the law is. What that really means, and I think to some extent some of them believe it, but I think more to the point is that certain kinds of questions probably lend themselves, sometimes one method might be more appropriate than another method. In terms of, and even originalism, you could take it a couple of different ways. You mentioned, Gabriel, changing technology. I remember one time it was a law that California had passed that said that stores that sold video games, if they were selling especially violent video games, people either had to be 16 or be with their parents. So that has implications for the First Amendment, because it was government passing a law that burdened the free exchange of ideas, because video games have been considered a type of expression that's protected. And so there was a line of questioning between Scalia and the lawyer for California. And I don't remember exactly what it was, except the lawyer trying to answer Justice Scalia's question wasn't sure exactly what he was asking. And Alito pipes up and says, Justice Scalia wants to know if James Madison would have played this video game. You know, he's saying he's really getting very literal with it. And then, of course, then the Constitution would have nothing to say about this. Or do you say, here's the core principle, and we're a little more fluid with it and can apply it in these more, you know, and you get answers all over the board on this. Okay. So sometimes, and I think I said this on the first day, sometimes people are attracted to the study of the law or the Constitution because they think this is going to be very straightforward, you know, not a ton of ambiguity, but that's just not true because language has a ton of ambiguity in it. And so there's always going to be some room for interpretation. So one of the things that we're going to do in the course is we're going to go through what are the rights in the Bill of Rights, because that is the chunk of the Constitution where most of the content is. We also spend a lot of time on the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment is the part of the Constitution that made the Bill of Rights eventually apply to the states. But I do like to take some time, and so let me ask you something. In the classes that you've had that are like an hour and 15 minutes, like this one, or even longer, do they give you, how are faculty handling it? Are they giving you breaks, or?
I had one class that I think every meeting at some point just gives like a 5-minute break, just set in the schedule where like he gives a slideshow and there's always just a slide that just says 5-minute break, and we stop at like, you know,
check your email and
10:20, come back at 10:25. You know, some people it's as simple as like, oh, they talked a bunch so they need a drink of water or something.
Right. Anybody else? Because it's, you know, over time,
it done as fast as possible so that like we always end up having extra time, so they just leave it at that. But yeah, no, we never got any breaks.
So you never got a break, but if you finished early, then you just went early. Is that what you're saying? Or not? It just feels like a lot of material. Let me do this. Let me talk a little bit. So, and then we have just a little chunk more. So the Constitution, you know, we have the Constitution, what I call the body of the Constitution. That's the 7 articles that they wrote. Article 1 creates the Congress. Article 2 creates the president and the executive branch. Article 3 creates the courts. Article 4 talks about the relationship between the states and the relationship between the states and the federal government. Article 5 sets out a process for amending it. Article 6, the important part is it says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In other words, it creates an entrenched constitution, and anything that is inconsistent with it is void. And then the 7th article was just specified how ratification would take place. So we go through all that, but the thing in the Constitution, you know, if you were to talk to the average person, they'd probably identify the most important part of the Constitution as these rights in the Bill of Rights. And there's probably more familiarity with some of the wording there. And yet these were added a couple of years later. So why do you, if these rights are so important, why do you think they weren't included in the Constitution in the first place? They forgot, they got tired.
Can you repeat that?
If these rights in the Bill of Rights are so important, why didn't they make it into the original Constitution? I mean, they come as an afterthought a couple of years later, and yet we say they're so important. So why didn't they think to include them?
I think I could be wrong here, but I thought I had heard some things in some history classes back in like middle school and high school, but I believe it was something along the lines of, country starting out on America is kind of this fledgling country on its own after the Revolutionary War, and America was kind of our primary focus was kind of getting our feet off the ground and moving forward, and we'd already been having issues with, obviously the current Constitution is not our only legal document we ever had. I'm sure everyone's heard of like the Articles of Confederation and stuff. So I think it's something along the lines of that. The Constitution is something that they kind of, after much debate and discourse, had agreed upon and wanted to put out there to kind of set the framework. But there were still, I think, even too closer to the release of the Bill of Rights, I think there was definitely more debate on what specific rights should be allotted to citizens and also what should be left, what should be a federal given right versus what should be up to individual states.
Yeah, and that last part gets onto part of it. There's broadly two reasons why the Bill of Rights wasn't included in the original Constitution. One is they thought it was unnecessary. They said, look, for one thing, they said, look, we've created a national government that is so weak, it's really kind of unnecessary. And they said, it is still going to be the case that most of the governing is going to be done with the states. And the state constitutions all have some form of rights, Bill of Rights in them. So it would just be kind of superfluous. So they weren't needed. The other reason was that some of the authors of the Constitution, like James Madison, thought it was actually dangerous to go down the road of, in the case of the federal Constitution, of coming up with the Bill of Rights, because he says, look, rights are inherently the people's. If you have a Bill of Rights that says, people have the right to this, that, and the other, people are going to think that rights are something, they're gifts from government. He says that's not how we think of rights. Rights are there inherently, they're God-given, regardless of what a constitution might say about it. And if you go down the road of creating a list of rights, inevitably you're going to forget something. And later on, anything that didn't make the cut for that list, people are going to say, well, yeah, maybe that other thing is also a right, but it must not be as important as these rights that made the list. And so it's going to make some rights, the ones that made it on the list, are going to seem more important than the ones that didn't make it. And in fact, that's why James Madison was insistent that they address that idea with the Ninth Amendment, because the Ninth Amendment essentially says, look, we just came up with a list of rights, but these rights that are enumerated, these rights that are specifically spelled out, should not be interpreted to mean that there aren't a lot more rights. There are other rights. And just because we have a list of rights, any of the other inherent rights that we have might be just as important as rights that didn't make this list. You have more rights than are on this list. I think, though, that James Madison was largely right. There was an influential article written back in the 70s about the Ninth Amendment that called it the Forgotten Amendment, because Madison was right. There's never been a Supreme Court decision that involving unenumerated rights that aren't in the Constitution, that they articulated and pointed straight at the Ninth Amendment. Dissenters have sometimes, or concurring opinions have, but justices feel like that's not enough. They have to feel, before they're going to articulate an unenumerated right, they're going to point to something else in the Constitution or some other reason for saying it. So Madison was right. If it's not in the Constitution, it does not have the same status. And we'll talk about one of the rights that's not articulated which is the right of privacy. And the court finally did find a right of privacy, but it's much more vulnerable than the rights that are specifically articulated. Okay, and that'll set the stage for that. So I had, the first quiz is just on those 4 theories, and I originally set it up so in like the multiple choice quiz, that really won't be very many questions, because what can you do with, 4 concepts? But I had set it up to be open Wednesday or Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I'm going to tack a couple of extra days on it because it's going to take me till this evening to be able to get those pages copied and uploaded for those of you who haven't had time to get the text yet. So the study guide is there though. So, I mean, most of it you could probably do with the notes in this case, but it's always nice to, sometimes it's essential. In this case, it's helpful, probably not necessary, but I do want you to have it. And we are meeting Thursday, and that calendar that I emailed you is also available on the D2L page. So any questions or concerns before we part?
No.
Are you putting the slides up from today?
I will, and thank you for reminding me. I'll do that right now. All right, you have a fabulous Tuesday and Wednesday, and I will see you on Thursday.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.